Sicilian 3 bishop b5 check tape. Right, start off at the initial position and we'll just consider the opening moves. 1 e4 c5, 2 knight f3 d6. Now, before playing the move 3 bishop b5 check, I want to talk generally about this opening. Now, the Sicilian is a very popular defence for black, and the move 2 d6 can lead to such popular variations of the Sicilian, such as the dragon variation, the Najdorf, and the Scheveningen. Now, for the player of the white pieces, the move 2 d6 is a big problem, because if he continues with 3 d4 leading to the mainline Sicilian, he has to face a tremendous variety of black weapons, and in order to survive he has to know a fair amount of theory. In fact, the player of the white side has to know much more than a practitioner of the Sicilian, who only needs to know his one particular variation, such as the dragon. So, apart from the practical aspect, bishop b5 check is a very good line to play from the psychological point of view, because the player of the black pieces has all his theory ready to play against 3 d4, the main line, and bishop b5 check immediately takes black out of theory, because there aren't many books on bishop b5 check and it hasn't been extensively analysed. And as I mentioned before, the practical aspect is that white doesn't have to learn a large amount of theory. So go back to the position on the board after e4, c5, knight f3, d6, and play the move 3 bishop b5 check. Now, it is surprising that this move hasn't been played much more often, because it's a very simple move. White develops this bishop with gain of time and prepares kingside castling. And in a lot of variations, this line of the Sicilian is similar to a Ruy Lopez, and another name for this variant could be the Lopez Sicilian, although strictly the Lopez Sicilian is against when black plays 2 knight c6 and white plays 3 bishop b5, and this will be featured on another tape. So after 3 bishop b5 check, black has a choice of interpositions, and we'll look at these in turn. He can play 3 bishop d7, or 3 knight d7, or 3 knight c6. Another point of the bishop b5 check Sicilian is that white has a number of interesting pawn sacrifices which he can use against all of these replies, or he can in fact play positionally against all of these replies, and so this opening isn't one-sided. White can either play tactically or positionally. So now we'll go on to consider black's replies in turn. So play the move 3 bishop d7 on the board. Now switch off the tape and see what you'd play as white here. Well, white has a choice of moves here. He can exchange the bishops with bishop takes d7 check, 4 bishop takes d7 check, or he can support his bishop with 4a4, or 4c4, or 4 queen e2. Now, first of all, I'm going to briefly discuss 4 queen e2. Now this is not a good move because after bishop takes b5, queen takes b5 check, queen d7, white has either to exchange queens or retreat his queen with a loss of time, and this gives black a satisfactory position. So queen e2 isn't a strong line for white. Now, first I'm going to consider the straightforward capture for bishop takes d7 check. Now black has a choice of recaptures. He can play 4 queen takes d7, or he can play 4 knight takes d7. Now the knight recapture is more passive, but it's probably a sounder move, since black immediately develops the knight, and also when black develops his knight on c6, white often has the possibility of a pawn break in the centre with c3 and d4, and then attacking the knight with d5, and you'll come on to see this point later. So the knight recapture is probably soundest, but it's more passive than the queen recapture. And first of all, we're going to look at games with the queen recapture. 4 queen takes d7. Now switch off the tape after 4 queen takes d7 by black and see what you'd play as white here. Well, the most popular move now is the immediate castling, 5 castles. White can also try 5c4, which gives white a very strong grip in the centre, but the move castles is played more often because it does give white the option of playing a very promising pawn sacrifice, and he still can play positionally with c4 if black doesn't allow this sacrifice. So white plays the move 5 castles kingside. Now black has a choice of replies here. He can develop his queen's knight, 5 knight c6, or he can play the move 5 e5 in order to prevent white from playing d4 immediately, or he can play the move knight f6, 5 knight f6, attacking the white e-pawn. Now first of all, I'll look at the move 5 e5. Now this isn't a good move because white can continue with 6 c3 followed by d4, and white's got a strong initiative. Now we will feature knight c6 later on this side of the tape, but first of all let's consider the move 5 knight f6. Now switch off the tape and see what you'd play here as white. Well, white has several possible moves. He can defend his e-pawn with rook e1 or queen e2, or he can advance it with 6 e5, and 6 e5 is the most aggressive move, and it poses the most problems for black, because after 6 e5 black's knight is attacked and he's almost compelled to capture on e5. And now we're going to follow a game that I played in the European Junior Championship in 1977. This was against Georgiev, the Bulgarian international master. After 6 e5, d takes e5, white recaptures, 7, knight takes e5. And now we see that white is gaining time by attacking the black queen. And black has a slightly awkward choice here as to where he should put his queen. Switch off the tape and see if you can find the best square for the queen. Well, probably the best move here is 7 queen c8. After queen c8, black can develop by either knight c6 or knight b to d7. Queen d5 isn't a good move, attacking the white knight on e5, because white can play rook e1, defending the knight, and then follow up later with knight c3, attacking the queen again with gain of time. My opponent played a bad move here. He played the move queen to c7. Now switch off the tape and see what you'd play here as white. Well, there are several moves for white here. He can defend his knight with rook e1 or queen e2, but I played the move 8 d4. Now this is a very aggressive move, and white immediately has some threats in the position. He's going to play bishop f4 with a threatened discovered attack on the black queen, and this already is slightly awkward for black. Now here my opponent played the move knight to c6, but before moving on, I think it's a good idea if we look at the alternatives for black. Well, he could play e6, or he could play knight b to d7. First of all, we'll look and see what happens if he plays e6. That's 8 e6. After e6, bishop f4. If black blocks the discovered attack threat with bishop d6, white has a powerful move in knight a3, threatening knight b5 and also knight c4, and this in fact leads to a tremendous advantage to white. After knight b d7, 8 knight b d7, white also has bishop f4 with a discovered attack threat, and black again has to lose time either exchanging on e5 or moving his queen. So go back to diagram 1. After 8 d4, black chose the only move here, knight c6. Now switch off the tape and see what you'd play here as white. Well, you've already been given a big hint in the other variations. White's main threat in the position is to play bishop f4, and after knight c6 I played 9 bishop f4. Now this looks very potent. White threatens knight g6 with a discovered attack on the queen and an attack on the black rook, and if black exchanges, white recaptures with the bishop, gaining time, and it's very awkward for black. But my opponent came up with an ingenious move here. He played the move 9 castles queenside. Now switch off the tape and see what you do here as white. Well, surprisingly, moving the knight is bad. 10 knight takes f7, queen takes f4, knight takes h8, leaves white in terrible trouble because he's vastly behind in development, and his knight on h8 is likely to be trapped. So that's a very bad line for white. And also the attack knight g6 fails to the move e5, and this is very awkward for white as well. So it came as quite a shock to me, this move 9 castles queenside, but white does in fact have a good move here. His best move is the move I played, 10 c3. It's surprising that this simple little move is so effective, because after 10 c3, if black captures on d4, 10 c takes d4, white's got the move 11 knight takes c6. Then black must recapture with the queen, queen takes c6, and then white simply recaptures on d4, c takes d4, and then black's in terrible trouble because of the open c file, and the black position is indefensible. And this is a very surprising position, that such a simple little move can be good. So after the move 10 c3, my opponent exchanged off the powerful knight on e5. Knight takes e5, 11 bishop takes e5, queen c6. Now white has the advantage here because black's king position is much weaker than white's king position, and white now played 12 knight d2. Black played e6. Now switch off the tape and see what you do here as white. Well, I played the move 13 b4. Did you guess this move? If black exchanges either on b4 or d4, then he loses immediately because of the open c file. And this is very awkward for black, because if he plays his pawn on to c4, then it's very likely that white will be able to surround it with queen e2, attacking it, and then if b5, play a4, which will open up all of the queen side against black's king. So this move created a very difficult problem for black. But he fought well. He played the move 13 knight d5, attacking the white c-pawn and preparing to evict the white bishop from e5. White played 14 queen f3. Black played f6. White played 15 bishop g3. Black played h5. White played 16 h3, giving the bishop a retreat square on h2. And now black has to face up to the fact that white does have this threat on the queen side, and so he tried for an immediate attack on the king side with the move g5, 16 g5. Now switch off the tape here and see what you do as white. Well, obviously white can just simply take the pawn on c5, b takes c5. But then black can gain a strong attack by moves such as g4, just sacrificing a pawn, followed by bishop e7, just simply opening up the g file. And I didn't want this to happen because after b takes c5, although white's a pawn up, it's not very easy for him to make progress. So in fact, I decided to sacrifice a pawn instead myself and played the move 17c4. Now this is awkward for black because if he plays the move knight takes b4, then queen takes f6 destroys his king side. So he played the move 17 knight f4. Now white's position looks terrible. His d pawn is pinned. Black's threatening to exchange the queens and then take the d pawn. And it seems that white has no way out. But switch off the tape and see if you can find what white did. Well, white in fact was ready for knight f4 and played the move 18 d5. Black must capture, e takes d5. White took the knight, bishop takes f4. Black recaptured, g takes f4. And now white played the move 20 b5. Black moved his queen, queen d7. Now switch off the tape and see if you can find white's move here. Well, white played 21 rook f1 to d1. Now let's consider this position for a while. Now black's temporarily a pawn up, but all of his kingside pawns are shattered, and the white knight is a very useful piece. If black's not careful, then the white knight could become established on a square such as d5, or perhaps later on f5. And also black's bishop is a very ineffective piece as long as white never captures the pawn on f4, because if it goes to d6 it's blocked by the pawn on f4 or h6. So black played here the move 21 queen f5. Now white captured 22 c takes d5, and black recaptured with the rook, rook takes d5. If black had captured with the queen, white would have moved the knight to e4, preventing the exchange of queens and swapping one pair of rooks. But as black captured with the rook, white played knight to c4, forcing the exchange of rooks. Rook takes d1 check, rook takes d1. Now let's consider the position again. Now black is still a pawn up, but in fact he's completely lost. His rook and bishop are out of play, and already white's pieces are starting to create very dangerous threats against the black king. Now black is in great difficulties, as can be seen by the fact that he cannot simply develop by 24 bishop e7, because white simply continues with 25 knight a5 attacking b7, and there's no defense. So black continued with the move 24 rook h7 in order to defend the b7 square. And white continued his attack with 25 queen a3. Now, switch off and see what would happen if black in fact defended with the move b6. Well, of course, after b6, white can play knight takes b6 check. And black cannot in fact defend the pawn on a7 because king b8 is refuted by rook d8 check. So he played an in-between move. He played 25 rook d7. And white simply moved his rook 26 rook e1. Now again, black cannot play b6 because of knight takes b6 check, a takes b6, queen a8 check, king c7, and then queen c6 check, which is very awkward for black. And black still cannot play king b8 because of rook e8 check. So he attacked the white knight, queen d5, 26 queen d5. Now switch off the tape again and see what you'd play here as white. Well, white in fact can sacrifice his knight here. 27 queen takes a7, queen takes c4, 28 queen a8 check, king c7, and now white plays 29 queen a5 check. And now if black retreats to the back rank, rook e8 is mate, so he must come forward, king d6, 30 queen b6 check, king d5, 31 queen e6 check. And black in fact resigned here, because after king d4, white's got a choice of moves. He can play rook e4 check, followed by taking the queen, or he could in fact take the rook first on d7, and then after king c3 play rook c1 check, again winning the queen. So black is well and truly routed. And this game shows the advantage of the very quick development of white's forces against black's rather slow development. So now go back to the starting position and we'll go through the moves again. 1 e4 c5, 2 knight f3 d6, 3 bishop b5 check, bishop d7, 4 bishop takes d7 check, queen takes d7, 5 castles. Now we've discussed e5. It's not good because white can play c3 and d4, and we've looked at one game with knight f6, 5 knight f6, which allows white to gain a dangerous initiative with 6 e5. Now black's most normal move here is the move 5 knight c6. Now this move allows white the possibility of a pawn sacrifice, and this pawn sacrifice is very promising. Now I briefly touched on this earlier when I said the fact that black develops his knight on c6 allows white at a later stage to play c3 and d4 and then attack the knight with d5. And we'll see how this works out. After knight c6, white now plays the move 6 c3. Now obviously black has to react boldly, otherwise white will build up a commanding centre with 7 d4. So he plays the move knight f6, f6, knight f6. Now switch off the tape and see what you'd play here as white. Now, I've already given you a big hint by saying that white is going to sacrifice a pawn. He can in fact defend his e-pawn with queen e2 or rook e1. But both of these moves allow black to consolidate with e6 and then on d4 to play d5, blocking up the position. So here white has this promising pawn sacrifice, 7 d4. Now let's consider this position for a moment. Black cannot block the position so easily now because white is threatening d5 in earnest, and if black simply plays e6, then white can play d5, gaining a tempo on the black knight on c6, and this gives white a strong initiative. So black's only real good line is to take the pawn, to take up the challenge with 7 knight takes e4. Now white plays 8 d5. Now switch off the tape and see what you'd play here as black. Well, black can retreat the knight. He can play knight b8, 8 knight b8, or 8 knight d8. Or he can play the move knight e5, which in fact is the move most often played in this position. The drawbacks of knight b8 and knight d8 are that black is prevented from castling queenside, and he still has a lot of problems over the future development of his queen's knight, and these are fairly substantial. After knight d8, white plays rook e1, attacking the black knight, and then after it retreats to f6, white plays bishop g5, and already black's got substantial problems. So black plays the move 8 knight e5. Now switch off the tape and see what you'd play here as white. Well, white can in fact regain his pawn by knight takes e5, d takes e5, rook e1. But after knight d6 or knight f6, black has good counterplay because he can quickly castle queenside, and he's got a potential pin with e6 pinning the white d pawn, which cannot capture because of the white queen on d1. So white could in fact regain the pawn here, but it would allow black to get out of a lot of his difficulties. So switch off and see what you'd play here as white. Well, the most aggressive move is 9 rook e1. Black captures on f3, knight takes f3 check, queen takes f3, black retreats, knight f6. Now switch off here again and see what you'd play as white. Well, black's a pawn up, but white's got strong pressure. He's got a rook on the half-open file attacking black's backward pawn on e7. But white's not got any object of attack at the moment. His main advantage lies in the fact that if black plays e6, then white's going to have pressure on the e6 pawn after capturing on e6. Obviously black can't play g6 at the moment because of the reply queen takes f6, it's likely that black could castle queenside. So white wants to be able to attack on two fronts. He might want to start a pawn storm on the queen side if black castles there, and he wants to have pressure against black's centre if black simply plays e6 and then tries to develop on the king side. The move he plays here is 11 knight a3. Now, not good would be bishop g5, because black can reply queen g4, and then black's threatening the exchange of queens, and that would be very unfavourable for white to exchange the queens, because he would lose a lot of his attacking force. But after 11 knight a3, if black plays queen g4, white can simply go queen d3 with a very good position. So after knight a3, black plays the move e5. Now obviously white has to capture. D takes e6, black recaptures, f takes e6. Now switch off the tape here and see if you can find white's next move. Well, I wonder really if you found white's move here. Now white's a pawn down, and although he's slightly ahead in development, black's simply threatening to consolidate with bishop e7 and castles kingside, and then black will be a sound pawn up. So obviously white must do something very energetic to justify his pawn sacrifice here, and it's very difficult to see what he should do, because bishop g5, black just plays bishop e7, and bishop f4, black just plays bishop e7. But white has a really startling move here, which stops bishop e7, and that's 13 bishop h6. Did you find this move? Well, this is quite awkward for black. He can't play bishop e7 because of bishop takes g7. He cannot capture on h6 because queen takes f6 followed by rook takes e6 check is immediately decisive. So black has a problem here. Now I've played this in 2 games, and in both games got a very good position as white. In one game, Taulbut against Linton, British Championship Air 1978, my opponent played the move 13 king f7, and after 14 bishop g5, bishop e7, 15 knight c4, queen c6, 16 queen e2, white has a big advantage because the e6 square is very weak, and black cannot defend by d5, obviously because of the knight fork, and if he defends by e5, then white can simply pile on the pressure with rook from a1 to d1, and this is extremely awkward for black. So king f7 doesn't seem to pose white many problems. In fact, he's got more than enough compensation for the pawn. In the game, in fact, my opponent chose to try and get his king out of the way with rook from h8 to e8, allowing queen takes e6 check, immediately recouping the pawn, just in order to get his king out of the way. So go back to diagram 2. After 13 bishop h6. King f7 doesn't solve black's problems. In fact, his best move is the castle queen side, which was played against me by Cuban Grandmaster Amador Rodriguez. After 13 castles queen side, white can still leave his bishop on h6. I played 14 rook a1 to d1. Black played knight d5. White played bishop g5. And black played rook e8. Now switch off the tape here and see if you can find white's next move. Well, in fact, I played a bad move here. I tried to attack too quickly with the move b4, 15 b4, trying to open up the queen side. I could have played a really strong move here. I don't know whether you've spotted it, and that was 15 queen h3. Now white has really dangerous threats here. He's threatening rook takes d5, e takes d5, rook takes e8 check. Now this position is quite awkward for black, and his best move here is probably h6, bishop c1, and then move the knight back to c7. And then white still has very good compensation for the pawn. But this is the move I'd missed, and I think this gives very good attacking chances for white in this line. Black still has great difficulties in developing his pieces, and the white knight will come to c4, and white can continue later with the plan I used in the game of playing b4, trying to open up the black king. And this is in fact probably black's best line against the pawn sacrifice, so you can see that it's a very promising line for white indeed. He gets a tremendous amount of attacking chances, and even if black defends very accurately, he's still got great difficulties to face. And this is the reason why queen takes d7, queen takes d7 has become a lot less popular in recent years because of this dangerous pawn sacrifice. End of side 1. Turn over to side 2 now. So go back to the start position and play the moves 1 e4 c5, 2 knight f3 d6, 3 bishop b5 check, bishop d7, 4 bishop takes d7 check, and now let's recapture with the knight. Knight takes d7. Now I've already said on the other side of the tape that this is the sounder but probably more passive recapture, but has become more popular in recent years because it's been seen that this pawn sacrifice by white is very dangerous and much more interesting for white than for black. So after 4 knight takes d7, switch off the tape and see what you do here as white. Well, obviously in the play in the centre with c3 and d4 is going to have considerably less effect now that black doesn't have a knight on c6. Black can simply develop with knight f6 and g6, or knight f6 and e6 and bishop e7, and white's play with c3 and d4 doesn't have an object of an attack. So white has to play in a different vein here, and we're going to follow a game Tal against Miles, played at the Riga Interzonal in 1979, to see white's strategy in this type of position. After 4 knight takes d7, white castle, 5 castles. Now this retains white's options. Miles played knight g to f6. Now switch off the tape and see what you'd play here. Well, there's several ways to defend the e-pawn. White can play d3 or queen e2 or rook e1. Now Tau played the move 6 queen e2. Now probably this is the best move because white isn't sure where he wants his king rook, where it's going to be fairly certain that the best square for the white queen is going to be on e2, which gives some power to the thrust e5 at some point, and also it's not easy to see where else the queen's going to go. So this is probably the most flexible move for white. Miles played 6 e6, and Tau decided to fianchetto his queen's bishop with 7 b3. Miles played bishop e7. Tau played bishop b2, and Miles castled. Now switch off the tape and see what you play here as white. Well, white played the straightforward 9 d4. This move obviously allows black to recapture, giving him temporarily a half-open c-file. But white's going to follow up with the move c4, so this isn't too bad positionally because white won't have to worry too much about pressure down the c-file. After d4, c takes d4, Tau recaptured with the knight, knight takes d4. Miles played queen to c7, and Tau duly played 11 c4, and Miles now played a6, which prevents knight b5 at some point and also prepares in the long run b5. Now this type of position has often been reached when both sides have a white squared bishop. But this position is more favourable to white because the light squared bishops have been exchanged off, and thus he doesn't have a bishop on e2 or d3 or c2 which is blocked in by the white pawns. And also white has a very strong grip on the squares b5 and d5 which prevent black from breaking out. So white's aim in this position is to slowly strangle black, to hold on to the queen side, the squares b5 and d5 in particular, and slowly build up for a kingside attack with f4, f5. If white can force black to play e5, then the square d5 becomes very weak and white will have a very good outpost. So we'll see how this works out in practice in this game. After 11 c4 a6, white played 12 knight c3. Black played rook fe8. This is a useful move. Black wants to retreat his bishop to f8 and then his rook's on the same line as the white queen. Now Tau played a very aggressive move here. Switch off and see if you could find what he played. Well, he played the move 13 f4, which looks very risky, but has a lot of point. White wants to play f5 and attack the weak point on e6 and force black to play e5, which will leave black with a bad bishop and a very backward d-pawn. So it's positionally quite well motivated, although it's very risky. And Miles took advantage of the weakening of white's position by playing the move Queen c5. Now switch off the tape and see if you can find white's move here. Well, in fact, white's only reasonable move is the move he played, 14 knight a4, attacking the queen and protecting the knight on d4. So Miles now played the move Queen h5, offering an exchange of queens. Switch off the tape and see if you can find what Taul played here. Well, surprisingly, Taul simply exchanged the queens. He has a reputation for being a very vigorous combinative player, but he's not averse to playing positionally if it's necessary, and here white has no good alternative to exchanging queens. So 15 queen takes h5, knight takes h5. And white continued with his theme. He played the move 16 f5. Now white's pressing home on e6, and it's quite awkward for black because it's very difficult for him. He can't play knight c5 because of the move f takes e6, and he doesn't want to play e5 because this will leave a hole on d5 and black will be very badly placed. So black really has to defend his e6 point somehow. He doesn't want to exchange off on f5 because this will leave squares for white on d5 and f5. So he's got to defend his e6 point by moving his bishop. And he's got a choice here of two bishop moves, bishop f8 and bishop f6. Well, Miles in fact played the inferior bishop f6, which looks much more active. But let's have a look at this position. After bishop f6, it's quite noticeable that the black knight on h5 is very poorly placed, and Taul duly exploited this. Switch off the tape and see what you could find as white's next move. Well, white played the move f takes e6, 17 f6 c6. If white had played g4 immediately, then black could take on d4 and play knight f6 with a good game. So after 17 f takes e6, Miles must recapture f takes e6. And again here, if Taul plays g4, then bishop takes d4 check, followed by knight f6 is good for black. But Taul played the move 18 rook ad1. So now we can see the point of white's play. He really is threatening g4 in earnest now, because after g4, bishop takes g4 check. He can now play rook takes d4, and then after knight hf6, he can play rook takes d6. And black can't move the knight on f6 because it's needed for the protection of the other knight on d7. So it's very difficult for black here because white has strong pressure on the d file, and black's knight on h5 is very precariously placed. Well, Miles, in fact, decided to try and bail out here, and he played the move knight c5, 18 knight c5. Now, switch off the tape and see what you'd play here as white. Well, you should have played the move you've been considering all along, 19 g4. Black has to follow a full sequence of moves now. After 19 g4, Miles played knight takes a4, white recaptures, b takes a4, black must take on d4 with the bishop, bishop takes d4 check. Now this is the crunch point. Which would you recapture with, the bishop or the rook? Well, in fact, it's best to capture with the bishop, because after rook takes d4, black can play e5, and then after rook takes d6, knight f6, and black is threatening both the pawns on e4 and g4. So Tal took with the bishop, 21 bishop takes d4, and now we can see that black is going to come out a pawn down. If he plays knight f6, white simply captures on f6. So black played e5, white took the knight on h5, g takes h5, black took on d4, e takes d4, and white recaptured 23, rook takes d4. Now let's consider the position. Well, Tal is in fact a pawn up, but his pawns are completely scattered. In fact, all of them are isolated, and he's got two sets of double pawns, and it may seem that white hasn't got enough advantage. In fact, white's got a fairly big advantage here, because black's also got two really weak pawns. The pawn on d6 is terribly weak, and black's pawn on b7 is also on a half open file, and white has good chances of annexing this pawn as well. And it's difficult for black to take all of white's pawns. There's so many of them that white will pick up probably the b7 pawn and the d6 pawn, and black will pick up perhaps the h5 pawn and one of the c and e pawns, but this will still leave white with one of the c and e pawns, which will be a pass pawn. And in fact, I won't continue with the remainder of this game, but Tal went on to win a very fine ending. Miles had some chance to draw, but in the end the difficulties were too much, and Tal went on to win. And this was a good illustration of white's strategy. Even after the exchange of queens, he continued with the same plan of f4, f5, hoping to induce black to play e5, but in fact the game diverged with Miles getting a knight trapped offside. But right, so now return to diagram 3 after 3 bishop b5 check bishop g7. Now I mentioned on the other side of the tape that white can also support his bishop with the moves 4a4 and 4c4. Now in fact, I'm only going to look at the move 4c4 on this tape. The move 4a4 doesn't pose black any great problems. He can simply develop with knight c6 and follow up later with a6. Or also he can simply play a6 immediately and force white to capture on d7. But the move 4c4 is very interesting, and I'm going to look at it. So 4c4. Now switch off the tape and see if you can find black's reply. Well, I played this move 4c4 in the Archeon Masters twice in 1981, and both my opponents replied with the move knight f6 for knight f6. Now you may ask, why doesn't black simply capture on b5, since this will give white double b pawns? It seems silly for white to defend his bishop in this way. Well, in fact, we're going to look at a game Taulbut-Coston in this tournament, the Art Young Masters, and see what the effect is of black recapturing on b5 at some point. But first of all, my opponent, Tony Coston, played the move for knight f6, and I played 5 knight c3. Black played g6. White played 6 e5. Black captured, d takes e5. White recaptured 7, knight takes e5. Now, in fact, black should just ignore white's play here. He should just continue developing with bishop g7. But he, in fact, succumbed to the bait of taking off white's bishop, and we'll see what happened. So 7 bishop takes b5. Now switch off the tape here and see which piece you'd recapture with. Well, white recaptured with the pawn. C takes b5. Now this seems strange, but in fact this is a very useful setup for white, because although his pawn structure is ragged with double pawns on the b file and a backward isolated pawn on the d file, the position is awkward for black, because this pawn on b5 has a tremendous cramping effect. Black can only develop his queen's knight to d7, and white will have an ideal post for his knight on c4, and this turns out to be quite awkward for black. After c takes b5, bishop g7, white castled, black castled. Now white played 10 queen f3, black played knight bd7, white played 11 knight c4, black played queen to c7, white played d3, 12 d3, with the idea of bishop g5 at some point. Black played h6, white played 13 rook e1, black played e5, and white played 14 a4. Now I'm going to stop the game here, in fact, because the game was quite lengthy and white eventually won with a very good knight on c4 against a bad bishop on g7. All the other pieces were exchanged. Now this is quite an interesting line, because although it seems at first sight very bad for white, white gets a very good square on c4 for this knight, and combined with the effect of his queen on f3, it's very awkward for black to develop his pieces, and this is quite a surprising quirk. It is quite awkward for black to develop, and this is quite a very, very strong position for white. Black has no active counterplay, and white can simply play moves such as bishop d2 and then knight e4, and if black exchanges, then white still got this tremendous knight on c4, and white went on to win the game with this very strongly posted knight. So we've seen in fact that after 4c4, exchanging on b5 at some point, only leaves white with a good square on c4, and stops black from developing his knight on the best square c6. Well, go back again to diagram 3, and after 4c4 we'll look at the way Tony Miles played against me in this line, because this was another very interesting game, and another game featuring a pawn sacrifice. So after c4, Miles played knight f6, and again I played the move knight to c3, but this time after knight c3, 5 knight c3, Miles didn't play g6, he played the move knight c6, putting the knight on the best square. I castled, 6 castled, and Miles decided to play e6, 6 e6. Now switch off the tape here and see what you'd play here as white. Well, the advantage of this bishop b5 check against the Sicilian is the fact that white's development is so rapid. He can just castle immediately on the king side, and he's always slightly ahead in development, and this enables him to try and bash black off the board very quickly. And a lot of the strongest lines for white involve pawn sacrifices. And here I played the move 7 bishop takes c6, which is really strange at first sight, but has a lot of point, because white wants to play the move d4, and the knight on c6 is very useful for black preventing this. After 7 bishop takes c6, bishop takes c6, switch off and see if you can find white's next move. Well, I've already almost shown you the move. White's obviously going to sacrifice a pawn here. He did so with the move 8 d4. Now black could simply recapture on d4, and then white has got a choice. He can recapture with the knight or the queen, and either gives white good play. But Miles chose to take the pawn offered. He played knight takes e4. White pushed on d5. Black captured on c3. Knight takes c3. White recaptured. B takes c3. Black retreated the bishop. Bishop d7. Now switch off and see if you can find white's next move. Well, white played knight g5. Again, white's got tremendous pressure down this half-open e-file, and black's already in some difficulties, because if he plays e5, then white can break open the position at some point with f4, and this is very awkward for black. For instance, let's have a sample look at this. e5, f4. Now if black plays the move h6, white has tremendous possibilities. He can sacrifice a piece with knight takes f7 followed by f takes e5 check, or he can possibly just retreat the knight to e4, knight e4, and this is again very awkward for black. And so Miles found the only move in this difficult position for black, played the move queen to e7, 11 queen e7, and white continued with 12 rook b1, black castled queenside. Now switch off
and see if you can find white's next move. Well, white in fact played 13 queen b3, which allows black to consolidate with b6, whereas in fact the move 13 queen f3 attacking f7 gives black a lot more problems, and white has a good initiative for a pawn. In the game, after 13 queen b3, black probably had a slight advantage, but the game ended in a draw. But after 13 queen f3, the situation is very unclear. Again, white has good attacking chances. He's got open files, the b file and the e file, and black's kingside is very difficult to develop. So back to the starting position. After 1 e4, c5, knight f3, d6, bishop b5 check. We've considered bishop d7 in some depth, and it's the most often met with move. But black has two other replies, the knight interpositions. First of all, knight d7 and then knight c6. It's possible that these lines can transpose if white captures on d7 at some point, or white captures on c6, as we'll see later. But first of all, I want to consider knight d7. Now, white has a choice here. He can play the position rather like a Ruy Lopez by playing the move 4c3, and then after a6, bishop a4, knight f6, queen e2, b5, bishop c2, bishop b7, d4. The position's quite similar in some ways to a Ruy Lopez if black plays e5. A game Taulbut Berlin, British Championship Brighton 77, black played, instead of e5, he played e6. And after castles, kingside, bishop e7, knight bd2, queen c7, bishop b1, knight b6, rook e1, knight fd7. Black had no problems because white's pawn advances in the centre, d5 and e5, are both ineffectual, and white must continue slowly with knight f1 and moving the bishop out. So in this particular line, playing like a Ruy Lopez doesn't present too many problems. There is one interesting point which we ought to cover, and this is a slight variation in the move order. So back to the starting position. After 1 e4 c5, 2 knight f3 d6, 3 bishop b5 check, knight d7, white can play c3, but he can also play the move castles kingside, and that's probably his strongest move. If black challenges the bishop immediately with a6, white can transpose into a line which we'll look at later with bishop takes d7 check. We'll look at this line later in conjunction with knight c6. But after 4 castles, we'll have a quick discussion of a game Vasyukov against Mestor, Hastings 78-79. As I've said, 4a6, white should capture on d7 and take advantage of his lead in development. 5 bishop takes d7 check. But black can also play knight gf6. And now Vazukov played the move 5 rook e1. Now again, after 5a6, white should capture on d7, which will lead to a pawn sacrifice, which we'll look at. But if black plays e5, white plays 6c3, black plays a6, white can now retreat his bishop to f1, 7 bishop f1. And this is a slight nuance in the move order, which is very good for white, because if black wants to develop his queen's bishop by playing b5, then white is very well placed to attack with a4. His bishop on f1 is very well placed for this. And this makes life very awkward for black in comparison to a normal Ruy-Lopez type position where the bishop would be on b3 or c2. This bishop on f1 is very well placed to attack a black pawn configuration b5 and a6, combined with the break a4. And in this game, Vazukov-Mestal, white duly exploited this fact. Now back to the starting position, and we'll consider the last move for black. After 1 e4 c5, 2 knight f3 d6, 3 bishop b5 check, knight c6. This is the most aggressive of black's moves and leads to the most fierce battles. As I've said earlier, this can also transpose into lines where black plays knight d7 if white captures on d7 with the bishop. And we're going to concentrate solely on a strong pawn sacrifice for white. After knight c6, white normally castles. Now if black played a6 immediately, white could capture on c6 and then play against the double pawns. So black plays bishop d7. Now white plays 5 rook e1, and black plays a6. Now white could retreat the bishop to f1, but here black's bishop is developed on d7 and there's no particular point, so he exchanges on c6. Bishop takes c6, bishop takes c6. Now black's got the 2 bishops, but he's considerably behind in development, and again white uses this theme of playing c3 and d4 to try and attack this bishop on c6. So white's move is c3. Now again this leads to a very similar pawn sacrifice. Black's move is knight f6, and white continues boldly with 8 d4. Now switch off the tape here and see whether you think black should take the pawn. Well, obviously if black takes the pawn with the knight, d5 would win a piece immediately, so he can only take the bishop. Bishop takes e4. And now white tries to exploit the pressure down the open e file with 9 bishop g5. Now here let's consider the position. White's very well developed, and black's still going to have several moves before he can castle. He must play either e6 or g6, move the bishop and then castle. So the situation is quite dangerous for black. But on the other hand, he is a pawn up. And I've played this position several times, and in all of the games white has got a fairly big advantage. In the game which we'll look at first, Taulbut Kuprajcik, in this position, black played the move 9 bishop d5. Now this is the best move. White was threatening to win a piece by bishop takes f6 followed by rook takes e4. The other alternatives to bishop d5 were bishop takes f3, which allows queen takes f3 and white's attacking b7 and f6, and bishop takes b1 when white simply captures rook takes b1. In both cases, white has a very good position, and it's very difficult for black to escape from the opening. But bishop d5 is the most testing move, because now white has a slight problem. If black simply retreated to c6, white could take on f6, bishop takes f6, and then push on with d5, and we've got this familiar setup where white's piling down on the backward e-pawn. But after bishop d5, white cannot do this because the bishop's blocking the d5 square. So switch off the tape and see what you do here as white. Well, white in fact sacrifices another pawn here. After 9 bishop d5, I played against Kuprajcik 10 c4. Now black has a choice of two moves here. Taulbut Kuprajcik went bishop takes c4. Kuprajcik boldly took another pawn, and after 11 knight c3, his best move is probably to capture on d4. But instead he played the move 11 e6, which turns out to be a very bad mistake. So switch off and see what you play here. Well, white played 12 bishop takes f6, which looks strange at first sight, but has a very useful point. If black recaptures with the g-pawn, white again pushes on d5, and black's got problems because of his weak centre and lack of development. So Kuprajcik just thought he could recapture with the queen. Queen takes f6. After all, why not? But now white plays the move 13 d takes c5, and black's in real trouble, because after d takes c5, white's got the move knight e5, which threatens queen d7 mate and knight takes c4. So Kuprajcik has real problems here, and he found the only move to survive, castles queenside. After 13 castles queenside, 14 queen a4, d5, 15 rook ac1, threatening b3, black was in real trouble and had to play the move e5, giving up another pawn. White captured, rook takes e5, queen to c6, white played b3, black exchanged queens, queen takes a4, knight takes a4, 18 f6, rook e5 to e1, bishop b5, and now I played the move 20 knight d4, where white still had a big advantage after bishop takes a4, but in fact, after the move knight b6 check, white has a really powerful advantage. It's very difficult for black to escape. And this shows the power of this line. So go back to diagram 4 now. Now Kuprajik took the pawn with bishop takes c4. But black can also play bishop takes f3, and we're going to have a quick look at the game Taulbut-Lawton, British Championship, Torquay 82. After bishop takes f3, queen takes f3, c takes d4. Black is 2 pawns up again, but his position is completely ruined. White played bishop takes f6, g takes f6, and now white can recoup his material with queen takes f6, rook g8, queen takes d4, bishop g7, queen d2, but then black has some play. So white instead played the move 13 knight d2, and this poses a lot of problems for black because b7 is still attacked and f6 is still attacked. Black played bishop g7, and after queen takes b7, he's in trouble because the e pawn's attacked, and obviously if rook b8, then rook takes e7 check is winning for white. So black had to play 14 e6, and then after queen c6 check, king e7, knight b3, f5, 17 rook a d1, rook c8, 18 queen takes a6. White had recouped his material, and black, although having a strong central pawn mass, was still in some trouble because his king was fairly exposed. And again, this line shows the great difficulties of the position for black, because his king always has problems. He's so far behind in development, it takes so long to develop his king's bishop. White usually has a very strong attack for the pawn sacrifice.